the organizations that do really well are the ones that help people have those conversations openly, talk about difference, and be able to navigate those differences without being divisive and, tearing down team dynamics. Because the goal is to just simply listen and understand and not to change the other. That's the
Mhm.
point.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced, and executive leaders to build community, grow capability, and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies, and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change.
Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Today I'm joined by Christina Howard, and fair warning, this conversation goes places you may not expect. Christina has spent decades inside Fortune 100 companies, sitting at the tables where culture, people strategy, and leadership decisions were made. She's led HR at scale, worked shoulder to shoulder with CEOs, and seen firsthand what happens when organizations get leadership right and when they really don't. But before all that, she was in the circus. Trapeze, body balancing, hanging upside down from the roof by her ankles were her norm. And you can see the impact of this world on her leadership. She is present, disciplined, comfortable with risk, and deeply aware of how much balance matters when everything else feels a little wobbly. In this conversation, we talk about what it really means to lead with intention, not the buzzword version, but the lived, sometimes messy version. We explore why self-awareness is no longer an optional for leaders, how your inner critic quietly runs meetings if you let it, and why values painted on a wall mean nothing unless they show up in your everyday behaviour. Christina also shares the deeply personal moment that pushed her out of corporate life and into building her own business. A decision shaped not by ambition, but by motherhood, mental health, and the realization that leadership is ultimately about proportions, not perfection. We also discuss emotional empathy versus intellectual empathy, what AI can do well and what it will never replace, why leaders who can genuinely connect will matter more as technology accelerates, and how to stay grounded when work, politics, and life all feels louder and more polarized right now than ever before. She also shares her simple framework called BAM: breathe, anchor, and move, and how to bring that into your everyday. So if you're leading people, building culture, or trying to stay human in a world moving at full tilt, this conversation is for you. Hello, Christina Howard, all the way from the US. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
Whereabouts in the US are you?
So right now I'm in California.
Right. So is it,
hmm
I'm just trying to work out time frames. It's evening there for you at the moment, right? But
It's
yesterday.
in the afternoon. It's 3
Yeah.
p.m.
Yeah.
Yes, I
Okay.
know. The time zones, I get confused inside the US, let alone between you and I. So
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So we're doing my research on you. I found it fascinating. You've gone from working in, well, leading HR in Fortune 100 companies, but
Mhm.
also being a circus member. And I want to talk about both. How do you go? How do you go from being a circus member to leading Fortune 100 companies in HR?
Well, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? So,
Well, I'm glad you said that.
yeah, right. Well, being a circus performer, you have to have clearly a lot of flexibility and you have to be able to be regulated and on and a lot of discipline and a lot of presence and attention. And,
Can I ask what you were doing in the circus?
oh goodness, I did everything. I
Oh,
did
did
all the
you?
things that you might imagine. Mind you, this was 30 years ago. So we didn't have the Cirque du Soleils back then. It was what you might see in a typical circus without all the animals. So I would do trapeze, I would do body balancing, I did back handsprings off of bicycles. I hung from the top of the circus tent by my ankle upside down on a, rope. We didn't have silks back then. So, and did lots of, tricks. And it was just a fascinating time.
Well, sounds like it was a great precursor to what you end up doing in a career perspective.
Right, right. Yeah. So, and so, yeah, so that was actually while I was at university there's this one university in the US that has a circus. And I thought, wow, that'd be really interesting to go and do. And so that's what I did for several years. And I would leave band practice and go straight to circus practice. And we did, many, many shows during the year, just like a typical circus would do. So it was a lot of fun. And we traveled as well. And it was an amazing time. And then leading into HR, I actually was going to university for
Mm.
HR and had a degree in it, and then parlayed that into a professional career after that.
And then from there, you've gone on and launched your own business called Intently, which is a great,
Yes.
great name. What
Thank
was
you.
the catalyst of stepping out on your own?
A lot of people think it was, for courageous reasons. And for me, it was out of necessity. I had always thought that I was a bit of an entrepreneur, but I had gone the traditional corporate route. 30 years ago, there weren't, at least from my perspective, there weren't a lot of, role models that I had grown up with that were entrepreneurial. And even though I was entrepreneurial in my mindset, I didn't see the path yet.
Mm.
And so I went the traditional route and worked at several different companies. And then when my son started having some mental health challenges when he was 10, it became imperative that I figure it out. And so I quit my full-time job and transitioned them into my first client, which I was very grateful for because I was actually coaching the entire IT leadership team and then also two of the senior executives in the organization at the time. And so I kept that part and made that my first clients in the new business. And I really focused on my son's well-being for at least 18 months until he was in a better place. So it gave me a time to have, kind of everything in the right proportions. I don't like to say in balance because, it ebbs and flows, right? But I had to get it to the right proportion. So it actually gave me the courage to step out on my own.
And then coming in from such corporate environments into a business of your own, what were the lessons that you brought in with you? Because I think that's quite often when we step out from a corporate world into our own businesses, we take a lot of lessons with us and we probably take a lot of lessons on what to do, what not to do. So what were those for you?
Right. That's a good question. I would say that when I went out on my own, I probably had a little bit of imposter syndrome around like, can I really do this? Is it possible? I've never done it before, which I think was a little bit healthy. And what I found is that all of my corporate experience in really large organizations was like a huge gift that I had that I could, kind of share with others in these small to medium sized businesses that I was working with. So I was very fortunate where I opened my business was a very big community of small to medium sized businesses. So it was just a great opportunity to apply those learnings.
And what lessons did you take in that you wouldn't be doing?
Hmm. Well, creating internal politics in my own team. Right. Um, and not having the challenging, tough conversations that are required sometimes to get to clarity, either with clients and or with my own team members as well. So a lot of
Mm.
times in the traditional organizations, we tend to, kind of yada yada over the things that feel too big to deal with when if we spend a few minutes and dedicate some time to it, we can actually have a complete breakthrough. And so, of course, I would not allow that to happen in my own business.
As a new entrepreneur, and a lot of people go through this when they step out on their own, is having the right people around you to support you to
Mhm.
achieve what you want to do. Who were those people for you?
So in the beginning, I was a solopreneur, right? And I surrounded myself with people who had paved, the path before me. I actually took advantage of the small business administration or association in my town as well. Did a lot of events and just surrounded myself with as many mentors as I could to ask questions and to learn from their experience and missteps. And then I networked just a ton and shared stories with people. And I would just ask for help. It was something that I didn't do very well previous to that. But after that moment with my son and just kind of like reprioritizing life in a certain way, it was a lot easier to ask for help. And so I did a lot of that in the beginning.
Yeah. We talk about leading with intent, and it's
Mhm.
quite a word. It's a common word that we use in leadership. You must lead with intent, or leadership
Mhm.
with intent. What does leading with intent mean from your perspective, given your business is called Intently as well?
Right. Yes. And so it is very important to me. And I consider it more of with intention, right? And that in order to lead with intent, you have to first have some self awareness and some self understanding of what your own intent is. And then you have to be able to align your actions with that intention. And if you don't understand who you are and you don't have self awareness, then that becomes pretty challenging.
Mm. How do you how do you build self-awareness in leaders?
It's a practice and it's asking a lot of questions. And sometimes it's playfully throwing things out for consideration because the value of having a coach is, when the leader is the fish in the water or fish in the bowl, they don't always see the water. And having somebody outside that's kind of paying attention to what you say, noticing your patterns can bring awareness to you. And so the way I always encourage leaders to do it is that they should also have mirrors in their lives and in their business in terms of, here's what I'm working on and tell me, when I do it well and when I do it the way that was my default by default. And that can be really helpful in identifying other mirrors as well. Like for me, one of my mirrors is my dog. He's a very sensitive dog. And I'm a type of person, like most high achievers, where I will take on a lot, I will do a lot, I'll put a lot on my plate and not always realize when I might be a little bit over functioning. But my dog very much reminds me because he'll start to get away from me. He doesn't want me to pet him because he can feel
Your
that I'm a
stress.
little bit, yeah, I'm stressed, right? So I think building some self awareness using mirrors and then obviously a coach. And there are also lots of practices of observing yourself and then being able to ask the question, what made me do that?
How do we build as leaders if you
Hmm.
want to build intentional behaviors within an organization as well? So lead
Hmm.
with intent, which will potentially mean I've built in intentional behaviors across the organization, not just at the top. What does it take to do that in an organization?
So that's an important question because a lot of times organizations will have values, right? They'll say, well, these are the
Mm.
core values that we believe in, and here's what they mean.
It's usually on a
And
wall when you walk into a business.
it's on a wall, right? But ask any one of the leaders around if they can name the values and what they mean, and you get wildly different, right, stories. And so, what I like to do is with the teams, do an exercise where, okay, well, we say that our value is courage. How are we going to define that? Because we can define that many different ways. And so we come up with a definition and then we go through. If we were watching this on TV, if we saw this in a movie, how would we know that this person was exhibiting the value of courage? And so it becomes very practical and very pragmatic so that we can all see that this is what it looks like. And those become more of like the practices, so the behaviors that show us that we're being courageous.
You've written about conquering your inner critic.
Yeah.
And I think all of us, I don't know any of us in leadership positions, have that voice in our head that is, very critical. It can be it's very rare we have a voice in our head. Well, most of us don't let go. Fantastic, Sadhna. Job well done. You are awesome today. We usually have an inner critic because we hold ourselves to really high standards. How do you manage that inner critic voice in your head? How did you do it when you first started your business?
So, first you have to catch it. You have to be aware, right?
Yeah, catching it. Yeah.
So, and sometimes you can link it to like, your shoulder keeps hurting in the same place. And then you start to ask yourself, what was I thinking about today? And then you start to see a pattern. So, I remember I mentioned shoulder because there was a time when I kept having this pain in my right shoulder, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And then I started asking myself, what have I been thinking about? And I was thinking about a significant relationship that was causing me a lot of like mental anguish and challenge, and it was showing up in my shoulder. And so that became a clue for me that I needed to pay attention to as well.
Right. Interesting. I have a pain in my shoulder almost every single day. Clearly, I need to pay attention to something. What are some of the mindset patterns leading on from this, the inner critic, the voice that we have? What are some of the mindset patterns you've observed with the high performing leaders that
Mhm.
you're working with? What are some of the common threads that you see?
So, a common one is if you hear yourself saying, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should be doing this. And I like to be a little bit playful about it and say, I don't think anybody should be shooting on themselves. And right, because it actually invokes shame because it's like a form of regret. And none of us ever grow from a place of shame. And so if we catch that kind of language inside internally, we just stop it. Just you can even just say stop, or you give it a big hug, right? You imagine that it's another version of you that's having a bad day, and you give it a big hug and you accept it because you have been doing the best job that you could, and now you have new information, right? So, but one of the mindset patterns is the shoulding that shows up very often.
Interesting. Rituals and routines, how do you, when you work with leaders, what are some of the rituals and routines that you see really work to keep them grounded? Whether, I'm leading a business, I'm trying to be a
Mhm.
parent, as you've just shared your story around that. I'm trying to be an entrepreneur leader. What are some of the really great rituals and routines you've seen with leaders?
Anything that brings them back to this moment and being present, because that is also partly responsible for the inner critic being able to enter because we are focused on the past and not the present, or we're focused on the future and not the present. So, grounding exercises and activities that help them come back to this moment are the ones that help them the most.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I've had somebody else say to me, another a leader say to me once, be where your feet are, which
Yeah.
in being present. So be where your feet are, and I have that in my mind all the time when I'm in meetings or talking to people because it is so
Mhm.
easy to get distracted. How do you coach leaders to step into the presence?
So one of the techniques I use is called, I just say BAM, breathe, anchor, or move. And it's similar to the one about the feet. And so breathe is you just pay attention to the breath, right? And if you can just slow down the breath, even when you're speaking, you can feel that is possible. And then anchor is about rooting yourself somehow and grounding yourself. So it might be the feet on the ground, it might be your hand on the desk, it might be a pen between your fingers, but anything that just makes you feel a little bit anchored. And then another way, if somebody is emotionally dysregulated and is having a hard time being present, then move is the last one. So get up, stand up, walk around. Some leaders, quite frankly, do much better in meetings if they are walking. So when I'm coaching, sometimes I'll have individuals go on a walk because they can process differently and they can be more emotionally regulated as well. But if you're in a really intense meeting, standing up, of course, not in a way to be intimidating and you have to read the room and all of that, right? Because that can also come across a different way.
Mm.
But being able to move around does help. And most of us in Zoom, whatnot, I'm always recommending a standing desk.
Yeah.
Right. So you can kind of lift up or lift down just to like change the state a little bit.
Mm.
So those three things: breathe, anchor, move.
I like that. Bam, breathe, anchor,
Mhm.
move. I might put that on my wall. Well, working in such large organizations that you did, prior to starting your own business,
Mhm.
there would have been a lot of work done around the culture by design piece in these
Right.
organizations. What does that look like in real life? Like, and we do talk about a lot that, we design our culture for our businesses. What does that
Mhm.
really look like in real life?
Well, it definitely starts with the values. And are we practicing the values? And then how do we pull that through the entire organization? So
Mm,
where does it show up in the hiring process, in the performance, process, in the transitioning or exit process as well? And, that's how we build that culture. I mean, a culture is just, actions and behaviors that are the norm for the group, right? And sometimes the culture happens by design if we're intentional about it. Oftentimes the culture happens by accident.
mm.
And those are the situations in which you go in and, you ask folks, where are we living as if we are in this culture and where are we outside of that? And that can be like really wildly fascinating information.
I want to talk about empathy because I know it's something you do a lot of work around.
Mhm.
And empathy is something that, leaders need a lot of. How do you build empathetic skills or the skill of empathy in leaders, particularly when it's not natural to them? Because it's not a skill that is natural to everybody. How do
Right.
you how do you build that with leaders?
So a lot of times it just takes a few extra minutes to build a little empathy. Everybody has the capacity to do it, and we just have to build the capability through practice and repetition. And, oftentimes if I sense that somebody is not having empathy for another, I'll ask them, if I were asking this other person, what do you think they would say about this situation? What would be their 100% perspective? And see if they can really articulate that. And another way is to ask, what's going on in their life right now that you're aware of? What is the context through which they're leading or performing? Because sometimes that has an impact on somebody's performance when they're showing up differently than they used to. So it's the, sit in their, stand in their shoes or sit in their seat. And then also this holographic thinking around, well, what do you know about them? What's going on for them? So that you can create a connection.
It's interesting, isn't it? So, in line with that, how do leaders, and I'm going to connect it back to values, because
Mhm.
we have values of an organization and we have values of the individual who work in that organization.
Right.
And the leader
Yeah.
has values as well, which is formed by, a
Mhm.
whole range of things. How do you get leaders to really understand the value that their people have? And is it really aligned with the organization's values?
Hopefully, the hiring process has helped to ensure that the ones that are hired have aligned values, and people are going to have different values, and there's probably going to be an intersection. I think it really just matters when there's a clash in the values, and that
Mm,
creates conflict,
mm.
and that's what you see show up sometimes in the workplace because people have a different interpretation of the values, or they have just fundamentally different values. And I always encourage leaders to know what their own values are. Obviously, we know what the organization's values are. And then I always want to know what's important to the team members as well. So they go through an exercise where they will look at both and then talk about potential conflicts that might arise because of how they see that value showing up.
You talk about intellectual empathy and emotional empathy. Tell me
Mhm.
the difference between the two of them.
So emotional empathy is feeling with someone, right? Like you can actually have like a sensation in your body where you almost can understand how the other person might be feeling from the inside out,
Mm.
right? And on an intellectual level, you can see analytically why it makes sense that this is happening for that person. So it's a little bit different feeling to the end user. So what you get from AI, quite frankly, in my opinion, is intellectual empathy,
Right.
right? It's fascinating. So that it has the ability to create intellectual empathy, and it doesn't have the ability, at least at this point, at this time, to create that emotional empathy. And I believe that that's what people are going to be starving for moving forward. We're already starving for that in terms of just the loneliness epidemic and the deaths of despair that our Surgeon General, has talked about as well. And so I think it's going to just continue to accelerate the more AI comes into the workplace.
Well, talking about that, it is already in the workplace, and a lot of
Yeah.
people are, using AI to generate conversations or, meeting notes and I don't know, EDMs and, the voice of the leader supposedly out of Chat GPT.
Hmm.
How will and there is a world where you go, if you look further down, and this is one of my concerns, is the AI works 24/7. It has no
Hmm.
family. It doesn't
Right.
need food or water. It doesn't have any emotions, and it will just work. And at some point there will be an intersection of where there will be an expectation, humans versus the AI, and leaders potentially managing an AI team
Hmm.
in their
Right.
business as such. How do you see all this playing out from a leadership perspective? Or what are some of, and we don't really know how it's going to play out, I'll ask
Right.
it differently. What are some of your concerns around this?
Well, I do believe that the leaders that will excel in the future are the ones that are able to connect with the other humans, that are emotionally intelligent, that can tap into emotional empathy and lead and get the most out of folks, and be able to lean into the technology and get the best out of that as well. So, I mean, I'm not a futurist in terms of knowing exactly what will happen to the workplace. And I think it will depend on industry or
Mm.
which industries we're in and what AI will take over. But a leader's ability to use AI to augment and support and almost like a personal assistant is going to be critical in the future.
We're currently living in some really polarizing times, and I don't want to talk politics, but
Why not? Everyone else is.
everyone else is. Everyone else is. And this will become a whole podcast on
Right.
politics, try and steer away from, right? Politics and religion. And I think
Exactly.
and I think particularly when we're looking at what's happening in the world right now, it is very, very polarizing,
Mhm.
from leadership to wars to decisions that are being made at leadership levels. And whether we like it or not, some of those politics and views and beliefs do seep into organizations, because you will
Mhm.
always have people with vastly different experiences and points of views working in an organization. And I'm really interested, I mean, more so than in Australia, but more so where you are right now. How is that? Are you seeing it seep into the workplace? And if you are,
Mhm.
how are leaders managing the polarization in their businesses?
I'm seeing it beginning to seep in, and in some industries more than others, for
Mm,
sure.
mm,
If you look at healthcare and some of the things that happened in the U.S. recently inside of healthcare and industries, politics is impacting. You see it in the tech here as well, and when it comes to the small to medium sized business. Same, right? And so employees are noticing the decisions that leadership is making, and, I like to say they vote with their feet
mm,
if they don't feel like they can have the conversation. But the organizations that do really well are the ones that help people have those conversations openly, talk about difference, and be able to navigate those differences without being divisive and, tearing down team dynamics. Because the goal is to just simply listen and understand and not to change the other. That's the
mm,
point.
mm. Do you also see it as a time, and perhaps it's not happening right now, but it might happen at some point in the not too distant future, that at some point there will be some leaders who will say it's time for us to take a stand, and
Mhm.
and if we don't have a voice that is opposite to what is happening, because we believe that what is happening is not right, that it is time
Mhm.
for business leaders to take a stand. How do you think that will play out? And how do leaders do that without actually um, connecting what they stand for back to the business?
In terms of, like applying their own values set
Yeah,
to the
yeah. And
business
I'll use an
or
example.
Mhm.
I've done it a few times in my life where I've sort of, got myself in a little bit of trouble where I've taken a stand on
Mhm.
something that's either happened politically or socially,
Mhm.
but because I'm connected with the business that I've been working with at the time, people also
Mhm.
automatically assume that that's a business views, and it's
Ah.
essentially not. So how do leaders in polarizing times take a stand
Mhm.
on issues without necessarily bringing the business in with them?
Well, I wonder if the leader can take a stand on a value
Mm.
and talk about values. And I would offer that that probably shows up in their business without sometimes having to take a stand specifically on politics, if that's what you mean, right? Because we all have many identities. And I think that's what we forget. We always say we want authenticity in leadership. And you can be, authentically you right now as the podcast host, you as a partner, you as a mom. These are all different versions of you, and they're all completely authentic, right? And so, being able to have your identity that is aligned to the business, your identity that is aligned to your personal, right? But the values are probably very similar.
We often use the terminology, we bring all of ourselves to the business. Do you agree
Hmm.
with that? Do you think we bring all of ourselves to business, or do you think, we leave some of the parts that shouldn't be in the business?
Right.
How do you see that really play out in real life?
I know that we want to bring all of ourselves to the business. I would say it a little bit differently in that the identity that I have that really benefits the business and I am benefited from the business is the all of me that I bring to the business, right? So and there's empathy in that as well because the business has a purpose and you want to be able to serve that purpose. And if you bring all of yourself to work and then you're not able to serve that purpose, then that means that the business fails. And that's against what you want to have happen. So I do believe that there's kind of a time and place for all parts of us, if you will.
Mm.
And I don't think that the team in my business wants to see how I am on a Friday night with my friends,
Yeah.
right? Or right on a Sunday brunch with my girlfriends, right? Or on vacation. That's a different part of me or identity that I bring into those situations because the business needs my business identity, which is 100% authentic.
Tell me a little about Intently, the business that you
Mhm.
started. And I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on HR models. It's a conversation I've had with many people on how traditional HR models are no longer relevant. But if they're no longer relevant, what are we replacing them with?
Yes. I spent a lot of time. I spent over or about two decades in HR. And what I found is you've got the very analytical sides of HR, which is benefits and compensation and, you know, um, all of those kinds of programs that are a little bit more analytical. And then you've got the ones that are more soft skills oriented with talent management, leadership development, employee relations and all of that. And there are certain things that can be automated and outsourced, but still need to have the foundation of the values of the organization because all of those analytical things have got to be aligned to the values,
Mm.
right? And how they spend their money and where we invest in health and wellness for employees. So do the soft skills side. So I think that a lot of times the talent management, the culture development, the organizational design will probably continue to stay in-house because it's a little bit it's more nuanced and some of the other things will probably become a center of excellence, if you will. And so I'm not sure what you have heard and all of your folks that you've spoken to.
Well, it's more, I think, with the work change in workplace, and we've now gone towards that flexible world of workplace,
Mhm.
diversity and inclusion and equity. That the traditional models that we've sometimes worked around in terms of hiring, how we hire people, for example, and do we put the names on there, and you know.
Mhm.
When we look at an organization, how do we convince the board that we actually need a balance of more women, or we need a balance of more
Mhm.
diverse people in the organization, and how what's our pool of people look like, that HR needs to have a voice around all of that. Whereas
Right.
traditionally
Hmm.
HR potentially didn't have a voice around all of that, and it was all done by the CEO. And
Mm.
that the role of the HR person is almost changing to sit side by side with the CEO to be able
Hmm.
to make some of those decisions with them, because it eventually does impact the whole of the organization at the end of the
Absolutely.
day.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that kind of that was the direction of the question. And I think I had the very good fortune of working in a lot of organizations where HR had a seat at the table, and I interviewed for that as well when I was interviewing for new positions, because I had worked in places where they didn't. And it was really frustrating because HR has such tremendous value and contribution to just the way the culture is shaped and how an organization is able to execute on strategy. And not having them as the thought partner to the CEO is a big miss. It's a
Mm,
huge miss if that's not
mm,
happening.
mm.
So I think that's like just the price of admission for any HR person, is that they need to work in an organization where they report in to the CEO, and they have a seat at the table.
Christina, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for making the time for us all the way from California. What's the weather like there at the moment?
70 and sunny.
Okay, now that doesn't mean much to
Oh, I
me
have to
because
do
we
the
were,
Celsius.
yes,
Uh, um, I would say
warm.
it's perfect weather possible.
Awesome. Well, enjoy, and thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
your time.
Thank you so much.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate, and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.